Okay, so since I did an overview of all the grand strategic World War II games, I decided to do a similar thing with the World War One games. Unfortunately, there are a few key players, or key games, which I have not played yet, and I'm not sure if I ever will. First and foremost in my head is Avalon Hill's Guns of August. And there's another game by that title as well, which is more modern. Also in there is 1914, also by Avalon Hill, which I've heard some interesting good things about. Their Weltkrieg campaign game I have not played or touched. I played the Western Front, and I know how the operational game works, but I can't talk to you about how the war as a whole is going to go with that. I haven't played Storm of Steel, which I'm very intrigued by, and Billy Boy, who's over at the Game Box as well as on a number of other sites, and is a big World War One player, is looking at that right now. And he may convince me to pick that up. That's a Decision Games game. But what about these guys? Well, first and foremost, let's talk about Diplomacy, the oldest of these, supposedly about World War One. Not actually. It gets the borders right for World War One, but the actual play of the game starts in 1901. It's limited to Europe, and it doesn't really correlate in any way to anything historical. It's an interesting game, but not even a war game in my view. It's a game about interactions and cutting deals, etc. But it doesn't give any kind of flow towards what the actual causes of the war are, or how it's conducted or anything. So let's talk about some of these others. Well, the oldest of these is the old Spi World War One. I've played this and covered it. This is an outstanding game in a lot of ways for how small it is. We're talking about, maybe a 4-hour game, 8 pages of rules, tiny little map. It unfolds. I'm not going to show you much of it. You can look at the video on it to see. But it packs a big punch in it for what it is. It's a Dunnigan design. It has some historical inaccuracies to it, but it has this nice idea of putting the economics first. So every attack is essentially an attack on the opposing country's economic power. You attack a unit, well, they could take a loss on the unit, but I actually don't even think they have the option to do so. In general, they take the losses as their economic capability, which is just they're going to keep burning reserves into that unit and throwing them in. Very similar to that is the Rand Great War game. So World War One has some issues with it. For example, Russia, it's possible for the Germans, I think, to really push on Russia hard and force a collapse early. It doesn't necessarily win you the game. I find it's a closely balanced game even under that, but it doesn't really feel terribly historical. All the entry dates and everything are all scripted in that. The Rand Great War takes that same economic model and puts it in a bigger design. This is being re-released, I want to say by One Small Step, but it might be a different publisher, a different small publisher, or at least proposed to be. It's on a P500 or some such. I found this a deeply flawed game. It uses that same economic principle, but the naval rules can completely destroy the game, and I found that it just does not play out terribly historically at all. The East Front, if the Germans throw a lot of attention towards it, if the Central Powers as a whole throw a lot of attention to it, they can basically roll up the East Front. Russia is completely scripted in it. All the minor countries, etc., come in kind of based on a random die roll type situation. But it's an intriguing game. It's one of those designs that I always felt like I should fix, and it caught my attention that way. Very similar to that and this is, following my order of these games, although I may have had the Great War earlier, is Le Grand Guerre, which came out, I don't know, I think a little earlier than Paths of Glory here. Le Grand Guerre is, to me, sort of the grail of the World War One games. The problem with it is, well, it has many problems. It, too, is a deeply flawed game, and therefore, I want to fix it, right? I've played it many, many times. It has a few issues with it, one of which is that, at least the way I play it, the manpower is at its highest basically at the end of 1914. And you'll basically never get, maybe the spring of 15, you'll never get your army to that size again. You just run it down so hard with the attacks. And that's making what I feel is fairly historical amounts of pressure. The game does kind of drive you towards that kind of historical pressure. The most beautiful thing about this game, though, is the political will system. A lot of games have had political will in them. The way that Le Grand Guerre handles it is basically every time you take a loss, every time you fail in an offensive, every time the opponent succeeds in an offensive, you're driving your national will downward. But it doesn't just go down to zero and then, oh, look, your country falls apart or something. No, it goes down to a certain level and then you start rolling and bad things happen. Mutinies, revolutions, all this can happen. And it's sort of this big, wonderfully random kaleidoscope. One of the problems with it is the designer didn't completely finish the game that he desired. I think the computer game may have done so. But I think there was a decision to hold off on some of the aspects of the design having to do with, grain production and stuff like that. It's an incredibly detailed game covering the entire war. There's a lot of excitement in it. But as I said, it has some serious flaws. One is the manpower situation that I'm talking about, where the armies just... you get to the point where you can barely manage an offensive. The second has to do with the naval rules, which now I'm beginning to see a fix for, but essentially the Germans are able to force the Brits to lose their navy. And the Brits have a lot more to risk in the naval combat, and the Germans have a lot of advantages in it. So it just does not work out that well for that. However, it is still, for me, my favorite of the World War One games. And I feel like if I could turn my mind to it, and turn some of the ideas that come from Balance of Powers to it, that I could actually make something that was much more historically accurate. I've very seldomly gotten an accurate playthrough of the game, something that felt like World War One. Paths of Glory. So, this is one of the highest rated games out of the wargaming genre as a whole. It's CDG, and therein actually lies the problem for me. It may or may not be historical when played right. If you play with the historical options, which may not be terribly well balanced, that take some victory points out of Italy, the game can kind of follow a certain kind of play that feels more historical than if you play it by the base rules. But the real problem I have with it has to do with the deck of cards itself, where you basically have to know the deck of cards to be able to play historically. I'm not sure you have to know the deck of cards really well to play well, but in order to get historical occurrences, you have to understand that certain cards trigger and allow for certain other cards. When you mix that with the fact that the players have control over certain random events, things like the Lusitania sinking, or weather events, or stuff like that, it really left a bad taste in my mouth, and I didn't feel like I was playing a very good historical war game. From what I understand, it's a tremendous competitive design, but only so-so. as a historical simulation. In particular, in terms of what kind of decisions I was making as a player. If my decisions are based on, oh, I want this card to be out of my deck, or I got to make sure I keep this card in my deck, or something like that, I don't feel like I'm really making the kinds of decisions that I should be in a war game. I feel like I'm making the kind of decisions that I should be maybe in Dominion, but not in a war game. And the final one is the most recent. This is Balance of Powers. It just came out from Compass. I'm very impressed with it. It's not as exciting as Le Grand Guerre, and it's not as light as any of these. Okay, it sits somewhere between these guys, and this guy is going to weigh in as the lightest, and Le Grand Guerre, closer to the Le Grand Guerre side of things. However, it does something LGG doesn't manage to do, which is give a fairly good historical view of things. And honestly, out of all of these, it gives the best historical presentation. For one thing, it gets rid of that naval problem. I think it suffers from a similar situation as Le Grand Guerre does in terms of the manpower. I don't know how to fix that in this game, but both games, which suffer from that, actually have this sort of, hey, the fronts seem right and everything, it's just, I don't have enough units. All the scenarios that are later have more units in them than I've got left at this point. And I don't know if that's just me being really bloody-minded. I think in both cases the game actually kind of drives that. Anyway, I'm also looking forward, also from Compass, there's actually 2 more World War One games coming out. Neither of which I'm sure I'm going to get. One of them is, and I should have listed this up front because it's existed for a while, is Fatal Alliances, which is World in Flames comes to World War One. The original Fatal Alliances used map overlays and new counters and different rules. This new version is going to have maps that are actually built for World War One to begin with, so you don't have to deal with the overlays. I know some friends of mine couldn't handle that. In some ways, World in Flames actually feels a little World War One-ish to me, which is one reason why I could see it being a fairly successful design. And then the other is the Lamps Are Going Out, which is a new design. I got a chance to play with it a little bit at Consum Expo. It wasn't ready for prime time yet, and I understand it's still, being tweaked. There are some balance issues that exist with it, but if the work comes out well, what I see that as coming out as is probably sort of a no retreat size and type of game. In terms of the way you're kind of thinking of it, if you're familiar with the World War II, I'm trying to remember the guy's name. It starts with a P, Paradis, something like that, who wrote No Retreat, and that whole series. Carl Paradis, yeah. Which is really a very competitive game, but not one that makes it feel like you're doing silly things in the way of this. Anyway, all 5 of the games that I have face up here have already been covered, so you can take a look at each of my coverage of those and get some idea of what I think of each of them in a little bit more depth. It really depends on what you're looking for. If you want a quick, short game, these are the 2 that I would recommend. If you're happier with CDGs, obviously Paths of Glory. But if you want a little bit closer to a real war game, and I'm not saying CDGs can't be a real war game. I mean, this certainly tries to be one. It's just, it has so many weird things that you're doing with that deck of cards, trying to manipulate it, that it doesn't feel like you're making military decisions. World War One does feel like it, but it's a lighter game. Only 8 pages of rules, like I said. This one, unless they fix it tremendously, and I haven't heard any signs that they're trying to, I can't really recommend the reprint for it. Not when this is sitting out here. Not when, there's other designs that are coming out at the same time that are very good. This is still a treasure, but seriously beware. Don't just decide based on this that, oh wow, this is the coolest game, I want to get it. Make sure you listen to much of my playthrough, because there's a lot in it that a lot of people will not like. Anyway, just a brief scan of the World War One games that I have available on the Grand Strategic level. I just want to do this, I don't know, because people seem to like it or something. I have no idea. All right.